welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. You are listening to Latin Ways. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson. I am delighted to be joined by Jorge Martin. He's the Secretariat of HOV Venezuela. Welcome to our program, Jorge.
It's a pleasure to be with you, as always.
Now, 2022 has been a year of many significant events. You know, the war in Ukraine, the new installing of a president in Haiti via Twitter by the U.S., and which sounds ridiculous, but shouldn't surprise us for us in Latin America. So why don't we start by maybe you telling us a little bit of the highlights that you feel we really ought to be paying attention to in 2022 that have occurred.
Well, there are a whole number of general processes that are taking place. And then there are some specific events that have also developed in the last few months. If you look at the situation from a more general point of view, we have now come out of the COVID pandemic, or at least the worst of it is behind us now. But obviously, the economic, social, and political impact is still remains. But nevertheless, we're not in a period where, as it was a year ago, 2 years ago, when there were lockdowns and restrictions to traveling and restrictions to production, and this affected really badly Latin America. Latin America was the region in the world that was worst affected from the pandemic, both from the point of view of a number of people who died in relation to the population, and also from the point of view of the economic impact. Millions of people have been thrown under the poverty line. Millions lost their jobs, tens of millions lost their jobs, and so on. But this is now behind. However, the economy has not recovered by any stretch of imagination. And in fact, at this point, when the economy hasn't fully recovered from the pandemic anywhere in the world, we are now tobogganing towards a new recession. Capitalism is in crisis again. In the United States, they've already had 2 quarters of negative growth. The European Union is following suit. This will have a massive impact in Latin America. There's also an increase in inflation, which is driven by a whole number of factors, but it's obviously been accelerated by the war in Ukraine, the disruption of supply lines, the increase in energy prices, and so on. So this is the general panorama. And I think that what we will see is a retying of the knot with what was happening before the pandemic. If you remember, before the pandemic, at the end of 2019, there were a whole number of mass popular uprisings in several countries, in Haiti, in Puerto Rico, in Ecuador, in Chile. And this was more or less this process of mass uprisings against the established system, against the capitalist system as an economic system that doesn't work, against bourgeois democracy as being completely discredited. That process was cut across by the pandemic, and it came to a halt temporarily. But I think that now we're going to see the same thing again. What's been happening in the last few weeks in Sri Lanka with the mass uprising, we will see again in Latin America. And we have already seen, in fact, even during the pandemic, we saw the national strike in Colombia, which lasted for several weeks, the national strike in Ecuador more recently. And these movements, what they reflect is a deep-rooted mistrust in the capitalist system and the attempt by the masses to look for a way out. Now, if you're asking me about the most specific events that have taken place that are significant this year, I will mention 3. One, the national strike in Ecuador, which was very strong, lasted for nearly 3 weeks, and put the government against the ropes, and he ended up with a partial victory. Some of the demands were achieved, some others were achieved partially, and some others are still being negotiated. And it showed again that the movement that took place in 2019 did not end up in a victory and will necessarily bring the masses back on the streets again. Number two, the election in Colombia. This was an historic event, the first time in the history of Colombia that a presidential candidate who describes himself as a left-winger, Petro, has won the election. In every single previous occasion where progressive or left-wing candidates had attempted to become president, they had either been killed or there had been military coups and so on. So this is a major turnaround for Colombia, and one which I think is rooted in the national strike the previous year. It was the national strike that defeated, that completely smashed the popularity of the previous president, Iván Duque, and prepared the ground for this victory in the polls. And I think it's a very, very important change. Now, if you look at the program of Petro, it's not a particularly radical program. He's been described as a communist by the right wing, but it's not a communist, and he never has claimed to. In fact, in his acceptance speech on the election night, he said, "We are here to, they say that we are here to abolish capitalism, but in fact we are here to develop capitalism," and which I think is very moderate statement. But the fact that he's been elected is very significant, and the movement that's behind him, the movement that propelled him to power, will want concrete resolution of the main problems that are affecting the working class, the majority in Colombia. That is the agrarian reform, the question of jobs, the question of education, the question of healthcare, corruption, the question of paramilitarism, and this is going to be very complicated. This is a major change has taken place in Colombia. Then, finally, number three of the significant events have taken place in Latin America in this year is the constitutional referendum in Chile, which took place last weekend, and that had a result that no one was expecting. The opinion polls were saying that the result was going to be close, perhaps with a slight majority for rejection of the new constitution. But in fact, in the end, those who voted against the constitution represented 63% of the electorate, and that needs to be explained. Why is that? And I mean, it'd be a bit of a long explanation, but if you want a short answer, I will say that they changed the election system. So now it became compulsory to vote, and this brought about 5 million people more onto the polls than previously. And the big majority of these people voted against the new constitution. These are people who are not necessarily very politically involved. They were affected by the propaganda of the right wing, had a scaremongering campaign about the new constitution, what it meant, and so on. But also, I think that it was a defeat for the Boric government, and the fact that the constitution was not very clear. The constitution is obviously an improvement on the previous one, which was drafted by the Pinochet regime, but it's a constitution that contains a lot of grand-sounding sentences about Chile being a social state of right, being plurinational, being based on parity, and a lot of very good, well-meaning phrases, but it doesn't say much about how to change the concrete conditions of life of the people who rose up in 2019. It doesn't say anything about jobs, doesn't say anything about the ownership of the renationalization of copper and other national resources. It doesn't say much about pensions, and so on. And so these people who came to vote for the first time could not be convinced just by general phrases. They looked around them. They saw an economic crisis, very difficult situation, and a government that wasn't really dealing with any of this. So I would say that the lesson is that this is a defeat of the postmodern left, left which is left only in name and is more worried about symbols and phrases and appearances rather than going to the root of things and changing things from the bottom up. So I will say that these are the general trends in the world situation and how they will affect Latin America. And on the other hand, I will say that these three events, the presidential election in Colombia, national strike in Ecuador, and the constitutional referendum in Chile, the most significant events this year so far. Now, going forward, we have the election in Brazil, where Bolsonaro is going to be defeated. There's big trouble going on in Argentina. The country is on the verge of bankruptcy. Economic crisis hit it very hard. And there's lots of other things going on, but I think that these are perhaps some of the most significant.
One of the things that is very salient, very important to me right now is to consider the impact that the whole COVID pandemic and the shutdown of many people's ability to make income has created, and now as the crisis grows, right, we now know that as you point out, the U.S. has had 2 periods of negative growth. We know that usually the capitalists don't want to lose money, and these times of crisis are very opportune times to increase the money for the capitalists. They tend to raise taxes, which usually means the poor get to pay for everything and the rich get their loopholes. And, a lot of people lose their homes. A lot of people lose whatever security they had built up. In Canada, we're starting to see that with increasing taxes, increasing taxation. We're also seeing that a lot of people were not able to recover and open up their business once COVID passed. So I'm curious how things are going in the UK, because as we noticing a turn to the right wing, while some places in Latin America are turning to the left, it seems to me that in the UK we're going in the opposite direction towards a more radical neoliberalist leader. Can you talk about that?
Yes, in fact, you are right and you are wrong, I will say, because it is true that the new government in Britain is more right-wing than the previous one. Many people thought that you couldn't get much worse than Boris Johnson, but Liz Truss is if anything, is worse. It's obviously not better. And some of the people she's appointed to the different ministerial posts are really horrible figures, really right-wing, reactionary, anti-immigrant, racist, and you name it, they have it. And they obviously wanting to rule in the interest of the capitalist class that they represent. But at the same time, we have to understand that Boris Johnson he had to resign because he was losing all the parliamentary elections, the partial parliamentary seats that were being contested, they were being lost. And so that meant that the members of parliament of the Conservative Party pushed him out. So he resigned because he was so unpopular amongst the electorate. It became a liability for his own members of parliament. But in fact, the people who have elected Liz Truss are not the public. It's just a small number, but I think about 81,000 members of the Tory party that voted for her. That doesn't mean that the country has shifted to the right. The members of the Conservative Party are swivel-eyed loons and reactionary people, but that doesn't mean that the country thinks that. In fact, now the Conservative Party is at its lowest point in the opinion polls that has been for many years. And what we are seeing now in Britain, in fact, is a wave of strikes. They called it the summer of discontent. And this is a wave of strikes that started in June with the railway workers. Then it was followed by the postal workers who are on strike today and tomorrow, 115,000 of them against the privatized Royal Mail. But it's now spreading, this summer of discontent of strikes, spreading to sections that are normally not considered to be very militant sections of the working class. Like, for instance, there's an all-out strike, indefinite strike of the barristers. With the gowns and the white wigs, setting up picket lines outside the Supreme Court. It's quite striking to see. And so what we see is that inflation, which is now very high, 10% annual inflation we have in Britain, and it could reach 22% by January, is pushing every section of the working class to come out on strike and to fight to maintain the living standards. Anyone who doesn't go out on strike and is maintained on contracts that have only increased by maybe 2%, then they are losing. They're losing out. They're losing the purchasing power of the wages. And the government is adamant that they will maintain a 2% wage limit for public sector workers, which is going to push them. To strike. Healthcare is now balloting for strike. Education, and next weekend is the Congress of the Trades Union Congress, the National Conference, and a number of motions are being discussed to coordinate the different strikes. In Britain, a general strike is illegal, but there's nothing to say that the different sectors cannot call for a strike on the same day. And this is quite likely, the coordination of different sections on strike. And at this point, there's even 70% of Conservative Party voters that are in favor of the renationalization of the energy companies, for instance, which is the center of the cost of living crisis, the energy bills. And I will say that this government of Liz Truss, who appears so radical to the left, will take measures that might seem surprising in order to stop the increase in the electricity and energy bills. Why? Because they fear that if they are left unchecked, the impact will be so much on ordinary working people that there will be an uprising, there will be an insurrection. And so in order to save the system, they're prepared. They just said they're going to invest 115 billion pounds in order to cap the energy prices. In fact, what this means is that instead of the consumers paying for the increase in energy prices, the government will give the money straight to the companies. So the capitalists never lose, but in this case, it will partially, very partially, alleviate the impact on working class families. And the reason they're doing this is not because they care about poor and working class people, but rather because they are afraid of this potential social explosion that will take place if these energy prices were left unchecked. So this is the situation in Britain. Yes, the government has shifted further to the right, but I will say that the people and particularly the workers are preparing a very sharp shift to the left.
You know, one of the things that I'm curious is how has the war in Ukraine affected Europe, in your opinion, and how do you see this unfolding?
I will say that what is happening in Britain now, with this wave of strikes, will be repeated throughout Europe in the next period. Europe is in for a very harsh winter because of the energy prices and the massive increase of these energy prices and the problems with supply. Because now Russia has said, well, if you continue with sanctions on Russia, we will not supply gas. The European Union is acting in a completely irresponsible way. They're now saying they're going to introduce a price cap on Russian gas, not only through the gas pipelines, but also liquefied gas that also comes into Europe. And the Russians are saying, well, we're not going to sell our gas below the price that the market is fixing, which is quite logical if you think about it. And this means that there's going to be very serious consequences for the people in the whole Europe. In Switzerland, they just introduced a new regulation that anyone who heats their homes over 19 degrees will be fined. This will become illegal. In Germany, they're going to introduce warm banks, which means that public buildings like libraries, COVID vaccination centers that were opened, or schools will be opened, heated by the state, so that people who cannot afford the energy bills, they don't have the money to heat their own, to keep their homes warm, can go there and keep warm for a few hours a day. It's a situation of a national emergency. They also talking about rationing energy to companies. Many factories will have to close down or work shorter hours because they don't have the energy. They don't have the energy, or they can't pay for it. Hundreds of thousands of small businesses in many countries will go bankrupt because of the energy bills. This is a situation of national emergency, and I'm thinking that in the next period the European Union will have to intervene. And in the same way that the British government is dedicating 115 billion pounds, the Europeans will have to invest a lot of money in order to prevent a massive social explosion. Last weekend, we saw a big demonstration in the Czech Republic. 75,000 people marched under a very confused number of slogans, and some of the people who had organized this demonstration were far-right organizations, but the main slogans were for negotiations with Russia, an end to the war in Ukraine, an end to sanctions to Russia, and this question of the cost of living crisis. This was mixed with all sorts of reactionary ideas, but the reactionaries in the Czech Republic had only managed to get a few thousand people, maybe 2,000, 5,000 people during the summer, and now they got 75,000 people to come out. People are very worried about what's going to happen this winter. In Italy, there has been a major government crisis, and now a right-wing government will come to power, which is more skeptic about the question of war in Ukraine. So all of these things are happening, and although there's a certain element of confusion, what is clear is that people are growing more uneasy about the impact of the cost of living crisis on their own pockets, on their own families, and there will be a reaction. In some cases, it will take place in the form of strikes, like in Britain, where workers will want to recover the lost ground in terms of the wages. In other cases, it will come through popular movements, mass demonstrations. And when the same governments are dedicating millions of pounds to save the energy companies, and they are saying that we are fighting in Ukraine because of our own interest, people will start to say, well, I mean, it is not our interest, this struggle in Ukraine. It's just in the interest of the ruling class, and we don't want it. So the mood is changing very rapidly everywhere in Europe, starting with this cost of living crisis, but it will develop into other things. And this comes at a time of global crisis of capitalism. I think that the ruling class is very worried, and they will need all the institutions that have any prestige in order to prop up the regime. There are some bourgeois economists that are talking about how this crisis combines the worst of the 2008 crisis, which was mainly centered around the question of national debt, austerity, and so on, and the worst of the crisis in the 1970s, where it was centered around the question of inflation, economic recession, and so on. This is going to be a crisis that combines recession, inflation, and high debts of the states, the households, and the companies. It's going to be a major disaster for capitalism. And I will say we have to struggle so that this time we don't come out of this crisis. The ruling class will always be able to come out of this crisis by making the workers pay. So this time I think we should make the capitalists pay, and we should put an end once and for all to this outdated, rotten system, which can only bring climate disaster, exploitation, imperialist domination, racism, and all the other evils of capitalism and imperialism in this epoch. It's about time.
As we come to an end, can you talk a little bit about Venezuela's victory against empire, because it has been massive aggression, invasions, and Venezuela still stands as an independent democratic country.
Yes, it's 3 years. The coup in Venezuela started in 2019, the most recent one, because there's been quite a lot. But the attempt of the U.S. administration to impose a person, Juan Guaido, whom they wanted to recognize as president of Venezuela, and this completely failed. And I would say it's a combination of different factors. One is the stupidity of the opposition in Venezuela. The Venezuelan opposition is so aloof, is so based on the small minority of the ruling class, so out of touch with the people of Venezuela, so attached and dependent on U.S. imperialism that is unable to carry out any decent attempts at overthrowing the regime. But this doesn't mean that this was not dangerous. It was very dangerous. It was very well prepared. They had links within the army, and above all, they had the support of the United States. And the United States is still the most powerful imperialist country on earth. If you read Bolton's book, The Room Where It All Happened, which is just published, he explains very in much detail how they prepared this coup. So one of the reasons is the stupidity of the Venezuelan opposition. But another one, I will say, is the enormous reservoir of anti-imperialist feeling and revolutionary feeling of the Venezuelan people. They're still going through a lot. Because we shouldn't forget the sanctions are still in place. There's all sorts of sanctions, but particularly on the oil exports, although they're now starting to open up a bit in relation to that, because they need oil in the context of the Ukraine war. But the Venezuelan people have very strong anti-imperialist feeling, quite rightly so. And this was a major factor in preventing the success of the opposition and imperialism in overthrowing the government in Venezuela. And that needs to be celebrated.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for all the ways that you keep us not only on the pulse of what is happening, but also to the importance of organizing and mobilizing and being in the path of creating life, right? Not just going along with the imperialist death path. So thank you again for being with us. How can people access your work?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you. And well, I'm the secretary of the Hands Off Venezuela campaign. People can check out our social media and website at handsoffvenezuela.org. I'm also an editor at In Defense of Marxism, because we think that without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. We need to understand and analyze not only the way the capitalist system works, but the failures and successes of past attempts to overthrow it. And so people can check our work also on Marxist.com. And I will encourage everyone to get involved in the movement against this system, to find out, to think, to reflect, and above all, to organize against this rotten.
Thank you again for being with us. Take care.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com.